The global financial architecture stands at a precarious crossroads, held together by a greenback tether that has defined the modern era. Since the Bretton Woods Agreement, the US dollar has functioned as the world's undisputed primary reserve currency, serving as the oxygen of international trade and the ultimate safe haven for central banks. However, the air is growing thin. We are witnessing the nascent stages of a seismic shift, a transition from a unipolar financial world to a fragmented, multipolar landscape. This is not merely a technical change in accounting. It is a fundamental conflict over the levers of global power. For decades, the exorbitant privilege of the dollar allowed the United States to run significant deficits and exert unparalleled geopolitical influence through financial sanctions. But as debt levels soar and alternative payment systems emerge from the East, the friction between the established order and emerging rivals is creating heat that threatens to melt the very foundations of global stability. This is the story of the currency conflict ahead, a silent war fought in basis points, swap lines, and digital ledgers that will ultimately rewrite the rules of wealth for every individual on the planet. The cracks in the facade began with a subtle but persistent divergence in global economic indicators. For years, the strength of the dollar was anchored by the high demand for U.S. treasuries, viewed as the risk-free asset of the world. However, as the U.S. national debt surpassed $34 trillion, the math started to shift. Interest rates, once kept at historic lows to stimulate growth, were forced upward to combat runaway inflation, creating a paradox of strong dollar pain for the rest of the world. When the Federal Reserve tightens liquidity, it doesn't just impact American mortgages. It sends shockwaves through emerging markets that hold dollar-denominated debt. We see the warning signs in the credit default swap, CDS, spreads of once stable nations, signaling a rising cost to insure against sovereign default. Central banks in Asia and the Middle East are quietly diversifying their holdings, moving away from the dollar toward gold and regional currencies. This isn't just an economic adjustment. It's a defensive maneuver against a system that many now perceive as weaponized. The signs of the crisis are no longer theoretical. They are reflected in the shrinking share of dollar reserves held globally, which has dropped from over 70% to closer to 58% in just 2 decades. To understand the gravity of this shift, one must analyze how an economic shock actually propagates through the global plumbing. It begins with a liquidity squeeze. When the supply of dollars dries up in international markets, the shadow banking system, where trillions in offshore dollar contracts reside, starts to seize. This is the eurodollar market, a massive web of credit that operates outside the direct control of the Federal Reserve. As liquidity evaporates, exchange rates become volatile, and the cost of servicing foreign debt skyrockets. For a country like Argentina or Turkey, a 10% appreciation in the dollar can translate into a catastrophic surge in the cost of importing fuel and food. This creates a feedback loop. As the local currency devalues, inflation explodes, forcing the domestic central bank to hike interest rates to levels that crush economic growth. We are seeing the mechanics of a margin call on entire nations. When the cost of capital rises, real estate markets from Sydney to London feel the chill, and the wealth effect that powered global consumption turns into a wealth vacuum. The transition to multipolarity isn't a smooth handover. It is a series of cascading shocks that expose the fragility of relying on a single nation's currency for the world's commercial lifeblood. Historical precedents offer a grim roadmap for what happens when currency structures collapse or shift violently. Look back to the 1997 Asian financial crisis, often referred to as the IMF crisis in South Korea. It was a classic example of a sudden stop in capital flows. Domestic banks and corporations had borrowed heavily in dollars, betting on pegged exchange rates. When the peg broke, the debt burden effectively doubled overnight, leading to mass bankruptcies and a loss of national sovereignty as the IMF imposed draconian austerity measures. Similarly, The 2010 Greek debt crisis demonstrated that even within a shared currency union like the Eurozone, the lack of a unified fiscal backstop creates existential risks. In Athens, life savings were frozen, and the real estate market plummeted as the country faced the Troika's demands. These cases illustrate a recurring theme. When a nation loses control over its currency or faces a mismatch between its income and its debt denomination, the social contract disintegrates. From the hyperinflation of Venezuela to the default of Argentina, the message is clear. Currency is not just a medium of exchange. It is a promise of stability that, once broken, takes generations to rebuild. For the United States, the erosion of dollar dominance isn't just a matter of prestige. It's a direct threat to the American standard of living. For decades, the U.S. has been able to import more than it exports, financing the difference by printing currency that the rest of the world was obligated to hold. This is the exorbitant privilege in action. If the world shifts toward a multipolar system, the demand for U.S. treasuries will inevitably decline. This would force interest rates to remain structurally higher to attract buyers, making the cost of servicing the $34 trillion national debt the single largest line item in the federal budget, surpassing even defense spending. As the petrodollar system weakens, with countries like Saudi Arabia exploring trades in yuan or rupees, the U.S. loses its primary tool for exporting inflation. Suddenly, the domestic economy would have to face the true cost of its consumption. We would see a persistent weakening of the exchange rate, leading to imported inflation, where the price of everything from iPhones to Toyotas climbs steadily, regardless of domestic policy. This shift marks the end of an era where the U.S. consumer was the world's buyer of last resort, replaced by a reality where the U.S. must compete for capital on the same footing as any other developed nation. The response from the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury to these shifting tides has been a blend of aggressive monetary policy and geopolitical posturing. To maintain the dollar's allure, the Fed has utilized its primary tool, the federal funds rate. By keeping rates higher for longer, they aim to create a yield carry that incentivizes global investors to keep their capital in dollar-denominated assets. However, this strategy is a double-edged sword. While it supports the exchange rate, it simultaneously tightens the noose around domestic regional banks and commercial real estate sectors, where trillions in loans must be refinanced at these higher costs. We are seeing the Treasury Department increase the frequency of bond auctions to fund the deficit, but the profile of the buyers is changing. As foreign central banks reduce their bid, the U.S. domestic financial system, pension funds, and insurance companies is being forced to absorb more supply. This creates a crowding out effect, where government borrowing starves the private sector of affordable credit. The central bank's maneuverability is narrowing. They are caught between the need to defend the dollar's global status and the need to prevent a systemic domestic collapse. As the macro environment shifts, the impact on individual lives manifests as a cost of living squeeze that feels relentless. In a multipolar currency world, the traditional American middle-class safety net, the fixed-rate mortgage, and the steady 401k, faces unprecedented volatility. When the dollar's purchasing power is challenged globally, the price of commodities, which are still largely priced in dollars, becomes a domestic battlefield. We see this at the gas pump and the grocery store. As the dollar's relative strength fluctuates against a basket of emerging currencies, the volatility is passed directly to the consumer. For the average family, this means that even if nominal wages rise, real wages, adjusted for the declining value of the currency, may actually be shrinking. Real estate, long considered the ultimate hedge, becomes a trap for those over-leveraged in a high-interest rate environment. In cities across the country, the dream of home ownership is deferred as the cost of borrowing outpaces income growth. The psychological toll is significant. A generation raised on the stability of the dollar now finds itself navigating an era of permanent inflation, where the rules of saving and spending have been fundamentally rewritten without their consent. The transition toward a multipolar currency regime is being accelerated by the rise of financial technology nationalism. As the U.S. utilized the SWIFT messaging system to enforce sanctions, it inadvertently incentivized the rest of the world to build parallel infrastructures. China's CIPS, cross-border interbank payment system, and the expansion of the BRICS Plus alliance represent more than just geopolitical posturing. They are the literal plumbing of a new financial era. These nations are moving toward local currency settlement agreements, bypassing the dollar entirely for bilateral trade. For the individual, this means the world is becoming more fragmented. A digital yuan, or a gold-backed regional currency, isn't just a foreign concept. It's a competitor for global liquidity. We are entering an age where the network effect that once made the dollar the only choice is being dismantled. This competition for dominance leads to currency wars, where nations intentionally devalue their money to gain a trade advantage, a race to the bottom that erodes the global middle class's purchasing power. The certainty of a single, global standard is being replaced by a complex, high-stakes game of digital ledgers and sovereign rivalry. In this environment, the concept of a safe haven is being radically redefined. Historically, when global tensions flared, capital flooded into U.S. Treasury bonds. But in a multipolar world, the definition of safety is migrating toward tangible assets and decentralized protocols. Gold has seen a resurgence in central bank reserves, hitting record highs as nations seek an asset with no issuer risk, meaning it cannot be frozen or devalued by a foreign government's policy. Simultaneously, the rise of Bitcoin and other digital assets represents a grassroots hedge against currency debasement. While volatile, these assets operate on a fixed supply, contrasting sharply with the infinite printing capabilities of sovereign states. For the viewer, understanding this flight to tangibility is crucial. It explains why institutional investors are aggressively moving into farmland, energy infrastructure, and precious metals. The goal is no longer just return on capital, but return of capital. As the dollar's monopoly on trust fades, the global economy is reverting to a more primal form of value, where scarcity trumps credit. This shift forces every participant in the economy to rethink the composition of their savings, moving away from pure paper assets toward a diversified portfolio that can withstand the fragmentation of the global financial order. The emergence of central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, represents the state's ultimate countermove in this currency conflict. As the private sector pivots toward decentralized assets, governments are racing to digitize their own tenders to maintain control over the monetary perimeter. A digital dollar, yuan, or euro, is not simply a high-tech version of cash. It is a programmable tool that allows for real-time monitoring of velocity and direct transmission of monetary policy. For the individual, this shift is a double-edged sword. While it promises faster cross-border transactions and reduced settlement risk, it also introduces a level of surveillance and programmability never before seen in human history. Imagine a currency that could have an expiration date to force spending, or one that restricts purchases based on a carbon footprint. In the multipolar struggle, the nation with the most efficient and widely adopted CBDC may gain a significant first-mover advantage in setting new global standards. This isn't just about convenience. It is about who owns the ledger of the future. The competition between these digital sovereign coins will likely define the next decade of the currency conflict, as the network effect shifts from physical banknotes to proprietary software protocols. The phenomenon of de-dollarization is often dismissed as a slow-moving trend. But history teaches us that financial collapses happen gradually, then suddenly. The catalyst for a sudden shift is often a loss of confidence in the underlying collateral. In the global system, that collateral is the U.S. Treasury bond. when major holders like China or Japan begin to reduce their exposure, not out of malice, but out of a need to defend their own currencies, it creates a supply-demand imbalance. This is the liquidity trap of the 21st century. As the U.S. Treasury issues record amounts of debt to fund social programs and military expenditures, the pool of willing buyers is shrinking. This forced the Federal Reserve into a corner. They must either let interest rates rise to levels that collapse the housing market and the banking sector, or they must step in as the buyer of last resort, essentially printing money to buy the government's own debt. This process, known as yield curve control, is the final stage before a currency undergoes a significant devaluation. For the average viewer, this means the very foundation of their safe investments, government bonds, may actually be the epicenter of the next great volatility event. To see how this plays out in the real world, we need only look at the modern-day struggles of nations caught in the crossfire of currency devaluation. Argentina serves as a haunting laboratory for the destruction of purchasing power. In a country that once ranked among the wealthiest in the world, chronic fiscal deficits and a lack of trust in the peso have led to annual inflation rates exceeding 100%. For the average citizen in Buenos Aires, holding local currency is like holding a melting ice cube. Wealth must be immediately converted into hard assets, black market dollars, or even durable consumer goods to preserve value. This currency flight isn't just an Argentine problem. It is a preview of the trust deficit that occurs when a state loses its grip on monetary discipline. When a society loses its unit of account, the social fabric begins to fray. Barter systems emerge, long-term planning becomes impossible, and the wealth gap widens as those with access to international banking protect themselves, while the poor are wiped out. These case studies are not outliers. They are the logical conclusion of a system where the anchor currency becomes unmoored from fiscal reality, forcing individuals to become their own central banks just to survive. The ripple effects of this currency conflict extend far beyond the exchange rate, deeply impacting the global real estate market. In a dollar-dominant world, U.S. property was the gold standard of fixed assets, a place for global elites to park excess liquidity. But as we move toward multipolarity, the flow of capital is changing direction. Higher domestic interest rates in the U.S., intended to defend the dollar, have created a lock-in effect, where homeowners are unable to sell, and buyers are priced out by mortgage costs. Meanwhile, in the commercial sector, the vacancy rates in major American cities are colliding with a credit crunch. Banks, wary of their own balance sheets as the value of their bond holdings fluctuates, are tightening lending standards. This is the liquidity paradox. While the world may have too many dollars in nominal terms, there is a desperate shortage of the right kind of liquidity to keep the wheels of industry turning. For the individual, this means the era of cheap, easy leverage is over. Wealth creation through property, which fueled the American middle class for 70 years, is being replaced by a struggle for equity in a world where the cost of capital is no longer predictable. As the conflict intensifies, the role of safe haven commodities like oil and gas becomes a central pillar of the new multipolar architecture. For half a century, the petrodollar recycling system acted as a stabilizer. Oil was sold in dollars, and those dollars were reinvested back into U.S. debt. This cycle provided the liquidity that greased the wheels of global finance. Today, that cycle is breaking. When major producers begin accepting alternative currencies, it creates a structural deficit for the dollar's demand. For the viewer, this shift is felt most acutely at the energy pump and in utility bills. If the dollar no longer commands the exclusive right to purchase the world's most essential energy resources, its value is subject to the whims of geopolitical cartels. This leads to energy-led inflation, where the domestic price of power becomes decoupled from domestic economic health. We are entering a period where resource-rich nations hold the real cards, and currency issuers must compete to prove their money is worth more than the paper it's printed on. The transition to a multipolar world is, at its core, a transition back to a resource-based valuation of wealth, leaving those in purely service-based, debt-heavy economies vulnerable to sudden price shocks. The structural instability of a shifting currency regime forces a radical rethink of individual survival strategies. In a unipolar world, the 60-40 portfolio, a mix of stocks and bonds, was the gold standard for retirement. In a multipolar conflict, this strategy can become a trap. When inflation remains structurally high due to currency devaluation, bonds lose their real value, and stocks face the pressure of rising input costs and shrinking consumer margins. Practical insights for the viewer start with the concept of geographic and asset diversification. This doesn't just mean buying different stocks. It means holding assets that exist outside the immediate blast zone of a single currency's volatility. We are seeing a move toward hard money assets, not just physical gold and silver, but also productive land and businesses with high pricing power. For the individual, the goal is to reduce counterparty risk. Every dollar in a bank account is a loan to that bank. Every government bond is a promise from a state. In a transition period, the value of those promises is what comes into question. Survival in this era requires a shift from a growth mindset to a preservation mindset, where the priority is protecting the purchasing power of one's labor against the invisible tax of monetary debasement. The concept of liquidity often feels abstract until it disappears. In the context of a currency conflict, liquidity is the ease with which you can exit a position or pay a debt without losing significant value. As the dollar's global dominance is challenged, we see the emergence of liquidity tiers. High-tier assets, like short-term sovereign debt from stable multipolar players or physical commodities, remain liquid. Low-tier assets, such as speculative tech stocks or real estate in overbuilt markets, become illiquid or frozen as the credit that fuels them vanishes. For the individual, the survival strategy involves maintaining a liquidity buffer, cash-like instruments that are not tied to a single point of failure. This is why many are now looking at cross-border digital stables or offshore accounts in neutral jurisdictions. The lesson from the 2008 GFC and the more recent regional banking crisis in the U.S. is that when the system catches a cold, the exit doors get very small, very fast. Protecting oneself means ensuring that your essential capital isn't locked behind a gate controlled by a central bank currently engaged in a geopolitical tug-of-war. The geopolitical chess match of the 21st century is increasingly played through the mechanism of financial sanctions, a weapon that has inadvertently accelerated the move toward multipolarity. When the U.S. and its allies froze the foreign exchange reserves of the Russian central bank following the invasion of Ukraine, the global perception of the dollar changed overnight. Every sovereign nation, from Brazil to India, realized that their savings, held in Western banks, were essentially IOUs that could be revoked at any moment for political reasons. This realization triggered a wave of capital repatriation. Nations are now moving their gold back to domestic vaults and setting up swap lines that bypass the New York clearing system. For the global economy, this means the neutrality of money is dead. We are entering an era of bifurcated finance, where your ability to transact depends on which geopolitical bloc you belong to. This fragmentation reduces the overall efficiency of global trade, leading to higher costs for consumers everywhere, as the efficiency dividend of a single global currency is replaced by the security premium of a multipolar one. The stress on the global system is perhaps most visible in the rising cost of sovereign risk, a concept that used to be reserved for developing nations, but has now arrived at the doorstep of the G7. In the past, the U.S. Treasury was the benchmark for stability. Today, the volatility in the bond market rivals that of high-growth technology stocks. This instability is measured by the MOVE Index, which tracks bond market turbulence. When the risk-free rate becomes risky, every other asset class must reprice. For the average person, this means that the interest rates on their credit cards, auto loans, and small business lines of credit are no longer anchored to a predictable reality. We are seeing a re-rating of the world's debt. In Turkey and Egypt, we've seen how quickly a currency can lose 30% to 50% of its value when investors lose faith in the sovereign's ability to manage its balance sheet. While the U.S. has the advantage of its scale, it is not immune to the laws of mathematics. As the world moves toward multipolarity, the blank check given to the dollar is being replaced by a strict ledger where every deficit is scrutinized by a global market that now has other options. The shift toward a multipolar currency system is creating a new era of resource protectionism. In a world where the dollar's value is questioned, nations that possess the raw materials of the future, lithium, cobalt, copper, and rare earth minerals, are beginning to demand payment in their own currencies or in baskets of commodities. This is the birth of the commodity-backed era. For the American consumer, this means that the era of cheap electronics and affordable green energy transitions is at risk. If the U.S. cannot print dollars to easily acquire these resources, the domestic cost of the energy transition will soar. We are seeing a tug-of-war over the global supply chain, where trade is no longer just about the lowest price, but about friendshoring and securing strategic autonomy. For the individual, this translates into structural inflation for manufactured goods. The convenience of the just-in-time global economy, which relied on a single stable currency, is being replaced by a just-in-case economy, where every link in the chain carries a premium for currency risk and geopolitical uncertainty. The psychological impact of losing a singular global currency anchor cannot be overstated. For generations, the U.S. dollar provided a sense of temporal stability. The idea that a dollar saved today would possess roughly the same purchasing power a decade from now. As we transition to a multipolar world, this collective trust evaporates, replaced by a scarcity mindset. We see this reflected in the behavioral economics of the modern era, a shift toward speculative gambling in markets, and a YOLO, you only live once, consumption pattern. When people lose faith in the future value of their money, they stop investing in long-term productivity and start chasing short-term nominal gains. This cultural shift mirrors the experiences of 1920s Weimar Germany or 1990s Russia, where the volatility of the medium of exchange led to a breakdown in social cohesion. For the individual, maintaining mental and financial optionality becomes a survival trait. This means staying mobile, keeping skills sharp in globally competitive industries, and refusing to be tethered to a single economic jurisdiction that may be on the losing side of the currency conflict. The endgame of the current currency conflict often points toward a grand reset of the international monetary system, a concept that is moving from the fringes of economic theory into the halls of power. Historically, when a dominant currency regime reaches its debt-to-GDP limit, a new accord is struck to rebalance global ledgers. We saw this in 1944 at Bretton Woods, and again in 1971 when the gold window was closed. Today, the conversation revolves around a SDR, special drawing rights, expansion, or a new digital reserve asset backed by a basket of commodities and currencies. For the individual, this transition phase is the most dangerous. It often involves financial repression, where governments keep interest rates below the rate of inflation to effectively burn off the value of their debt at the expense of savers. This is the hidden tax of the multipolar shift. Understanding this allows the proactive viewer to position themselves not in promises to pay, but in the things that can't be printed. As the old world of dollar hegemony fades, the winners will be those who recognize that the rules were being rewritten in real time and moved their value into the new, fragmented architecture before the old gates were permanently locked. As the global conflict for currency supremacy matures, the middle-class trap becomes a prominent feature of the American economic landscape. For decades, wealth was built on the appreciation of assets like the suburban home and the diversified 401k, both of which relied on a stable, low-inflation dollar. In the new multipolar reality, the middle class finds itself caught between stagnant real wages and the rising costs of unprintable necessities like healthcare, education, and energy. We are seeing a K-shaped recovery from every minor shock, where those with the financial literacy to navigate currency hedges pull away, while those relying on traditional savings are left behind. This is the hollowing out effect. When the dollar's dominance is challenged, the government's ability to provide a social safety net without massive currency debasement is compromised. For the viewer, the practical insight is clear. The passive wealth generation of the late 20th century is a relic. Today, survival requires active management of purchasing power risk. It is no longer enough to save money. One must strategically deploy it into sectors that benefit from the shifting global order, such as domestic manufacturing, resource tech, and infrastructure, that reduces dependence on globalized, dollar-denominated supply chains. The conflict ahead is not just one of nations, but of philosophies. The centralized control of sovereign money versus the decentralized resilience of private and digital alternatives. We are witnessing a great fragmentation where the global financial system is splitting into competing zones of influence. For the United States, the challenge is to maintain the dollar's utility as a global public good while managing a domestic fiscal crisis. This requires a delicate balancing act of soft power and technological innovation. If the U.S. fails to adapt, we could see the rise of regional currency blocks, a yuan-based bloc in the East, a euro-based bloc in the West, and perhaps a commodity-backed bloc in the global South. For the global citizen, this means the end of a single, universal price of everything. Arbitrage, the practice of taking advantage of price differences in different markets, will become a primary way of building wealth. The practical takeaway is to cultivate intellectual and financial agility. Understanding the flow of global liquidity across these new borders is the key to surviving the transition. The conflict is inevitable, but the outcome for the individual depends on their ability to see the world as it is becoming, rather than as it was. As we look toward the horizon, the narrative of dollar dominance is being replaced by the currency conflict of the 2020s and beyond. This transition period is likely to be characterized by financial volatility that becomes the new baseline. For the individual, the most important lesson from this deep dive into the global monetary plumbing is that stability is not a permanent state. It is an era-dependent phenomenon. The unipolar world of the past was an anomaly of history, and we are returning to a more traditional, competitive multipolarity. This means the return of real interest rates, where the cost of money actually reflects its scarcity and risk. The practical path forward involves a radical decoupling from the debt-fueled lifestyle that the dollar's exorbitant privilege once encouraged. By focusing on debt reduction, asset diversification, and the acquisition of skills that are valuable in any currency, the individual can transform from a victim of the macro shocks into a resilient participant in the new economy. The conflict ahead is daunting, but it also creates opportunities for those who can navigate the fragmentation of the global order. The era of the dollar may be changing, but the principles of value, scarcity, and trust remain the ultimate compass in an uncertain world. The ultimate resolution of this currency conflict will likely manifest as a digital Bretton Woods, a high-stakes negotiation where the new rules of the game are codified for the Internet age. In this scenario, the winners will be those who control the gateways, the on-ramps and off-ramps between sovereign digital currencies and private assets. We are moving toward a world of atomic settlement, where trades happen instantly, and the need for massive piles of reserve dollars to cover settlement risk evaporates. For the viewer, This means that the speed of money is about to accelerate, but so is the speed of contagion. A crisis in a digital yuan-linked ledger can spread to a dollar-linked protocol in milliseconds. Practical survival in this hyper-connected but fragmented world requires technological literacy. Understanding how to use non-custodial wallets, how to bridge assets between different chains, and how to verify the proof of reserves of a financial institution will become as basic a skill as balancing a checkbook once was. The multipolar era is not just about different names on the bills. It is about a fundamental shift in how value is recorded, transmitted, and protected in a world that no longer trusts a single central authority. The final act of this currency transition will be written in the behavior of the Global South, a collective of nations that are no longer content to be peripheral players in a Western-centric financial system. As these countries gain economic weight, they are demanding a neutral reserve asset that is not subject to the domestic policy shifts of the U.S. Federal Reserve. This demand is the driving force behind the development of synthetic reserve currencies, baskets of assets that include commodities, regional currencies, and perhaps even decentralized digital tokens. For the individual in the West, this signifies the end of monetary isolationism. We can no longer ignore the health of the Brazilian real or the Indian rupee, as their stability is now inextricably linked to the global price of the goods we consume. The practical insight here is global awareness. A multipolar world requires a multipolar mindset. Investors and savers must look beyond their own borders to identify where real growth and sound monetary policy are occurring. In the conflict ahead, the most significant risk is home bias, the tendency to keep all eggs in a single, local basket that is being systematically devalued by the forces of history. The transition from a unipolar to a multipolar financial system is perhaps the most significant economic event of our lifetimes, a paradigm shift that demands a total reevaluation of what we consider wealth. We have moved from an era of undisputed dollar dominance, where the greenback served as the world's singular, unquestioned trust anchor, to a complex, contested landscape where multiple powers compete for monetary influence. This conflict is not a distant geopolitical game. It is reflected in the interest rate on your bank loan, the price of the food on your table, and the long-term viability of your retirement savings. The signs of the crisis have matured into a new reality of structural inflation and heightened volatility. However, where there is fragmentation, there is also the opportunity for resilience. By understanding the mechanics of currency debasement, the importance of hard assets, and the rise of decentralized alternatives, individuals can navigate this friction with confidence. The future will not be defined by a single currency, but by the ability to move fluidly between different systems of value. The era of passive reliance on a single sovereign promise is over. The era of the active, informed global citizen has begun. As the credits roll on the era of undisputed dollar hegemony, the final message is not one of despair, but of radical responsibility. The currency conflict ahead is a call to awaken from the complacency of the past 80 years. We are entering a world where the exorbitant privilege of one nation has been replaced by the exorbitant risk of many. In this multipolar landscape, the ultimate currency is no longer paper, gold, or digital code. It is knowledge. The ability to discern between a temporary market fluctuation and a structural shift in the global order will be the dividing line between those who thrive and those who are swept away. The individual survival strategies we have discussed, asset diversification, debt reduction, and technological agility, are the modern tools of sovereignty. As the global powers negotiate the terms of a new financial peace, the most resilient among us will be those who have built their own personal reserve systems, independent of any single government's failures. The greenback may lose its crown, but the human drive for value, trade, and progress will find new channels. The conflict is the forge. What emerges will be a more complex, perhaps more honest, global economy. The question is no longer if the world will change, but how prepared you are to change with it. How does this story resonate with you? I'd like to hear your perspective, so feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. If you found this video useful, consider subscribing and giving it a like. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.